But in 2008, previously unseen pieces of the Gospel of Judas begin to emerge.
There's always one last twist with the story of Judas, and here we have another one. Bruce Farini, a dealer in Ohio, kept back a few of the papyrus fragments of the Gospel of Judas.
These pieces are seized along with Farini's other assets when he goes bankrupt. For the first time, the Gospel of Judas is complete. And its real message is far more shocking than anyone could have imagined. The betrayal of Jesus is one of the most infamous crimes in history. The discovery of the lost Gospel of Judas put Judas Iscariot on trial once again. Now new evidence in the form of missing fragments of the text has come to light.
The most important fragment for scholars is the fragment on the final page, which is thought to resolve the question of who enters the cloud at the end of the text.
Before these missing pieces resurfaced, scholars assumed that it is Judas who enters the cloud.
Whoever enters the cloud is actually the one who ascends to the highest heaven. This final fragment clarifies that it is in fact Jesus and not Judas who enters the cloud.
But Judas himself isn't the person that the author in the text is most interested in.
Regardless of whether Judas is a good or bad character in this text, what most scholars would agree is that the Gospel of Judas is not really about the figure of Judas. The disciples are the ones being criticized by the author.
The real shock reveal of the Gospel of Judas is that none of the disciples are good. That's what really probably should have been the headline. None of the disciples are that great.
The Gospel of Judas is a damning portrayal, not just of Judas, but of all the disciples at the Last Supper.
What's surprising is that the Gospel of Judas actually depicts the disciples as misguided idiots, people who don't have access to the truth. Really, Jesus treats them as a lost cause.
In the Gospel of Judas, the other disciples are praying and venerating in ways that makes Jesus laugh at them.
Why are you laughing at our Thanksgiving?
And they seem to be leading people astray.
It is what is right.
I am not laughing at you!
Nor are you doing this by your will, but rather it is by this that your God will be praised.
The Gospel of Judas pictures the disciples as clueless.
This image of the disciples and of Judas is the key to unlocking the true meaning of the Gospel of Judas.
The disciples are accused of despicable acts. They are clearly the villains of this text.
And the author drives the point home in a lurid dream sequence.
The disciples' nightmare is absolutely horrific. It's just a terrifying scene.
They are sacrificing their wives and children. There are men engaged in sexual relations with men.
We saw a great house with a great altar in it.
It's sort of a panoply of sin, and they're very frightened by this vision that they have, and they're not really sure what it means.
12 people whom we say are priests.
Jesus responds by saying, terrible things are going to be done in my name, and in fact, you're going to be the ones who are doing it.
You who receive the offerings for the altar that you have stolen.
They think that they're following God. They think that they're serving Jesus. They've been misled all this time.
The message of the Gospel of Judas is not simply that Jesus is betrayed by Judas in his lifetime, but that his teachings are being betrayed after his death.
The author of the Gospel of Judas is angry, but he's not angry at the events that transpired in the first century between Jesus and Judas. He's angry at church leaders in the 2nd century.
The Gospel of Judas is critical of all the disciples of Jesus, frankly, and these disciples are standing as kind of ciphers. They're symbols of the Orthodox Church of the 2nd century.
It seems that it's written as a criticism of mainstream Christians who are engaged in worships that are led by bishops or clerics of one kind or another. And the authors of this text, they don't like that kind of clericalism, they don't like that kind of religious service, and they are strongly discouraging people from participating in it.
The Gospel of Judas is a polemic. It's a political smear against the people running the early church.
The apostolic church was emerging, the institutional church was emerging. What we know as Christianity was emerging. The Gospel of Judas was kind of a narrative against this institutional Christianity.
Written decades after the New Testament Gospels, the Gospel of Judas is less a story about Jesus than a condemnation of the leadership of the early church.
It gives us an alternate picture of the formation of Christianity. It doesn't show Christianity as developing necessarily all harmoniously. There are dissenters. There were people who felt that things had gotten off on the wrong track.
The Gospel of Judas suggests that church leadership is mistaken, is more diabolic than divine.
So controversial is the Gospel of Judas that in 180 AD, the Bishop of Lyon declares it heresy.
I can easily imagine people throwing this text out as being heretical. If you were a member of the Orthodoxy in the 2nd century and you read this text, I can imagine you would be pretty upset. It's a pretty scathing indictment of your beliefs and what you're all about.
Suppressed by the church, the Gospel of Judas lies buried for nearly 2 millennia. But history does not forgive Judas or forget his fate. The newly decoded Gospel of Judas is more than just the story of the most infamous disciple. Why then is it called the Gospel of Judas at all?
The author of the Gospel of Judas chose Judas as the leading figure in the text because Judas was a notorious figure. He was an attention getter in antiquity as he is today.
Anyone who would choose to write a Gospel of Judas was certainly making a conscious decision to pick a figure who wasn't accepted by the Orthodox Church.
The Judas character in the Gospel of Judas is not a great deal different from Judas as we see him on the pages of the New Testament.
Judas has always been a complicated character. Ambiguity around Judas and the fascination has always been there.
There's no way that the gospel writers would have made up a character in Jesus' inner circle who would have betrayed Jesus. He's not just kind of a mythical person. Judas obviously is someone who's going through a lot of conflict. He's a real person with real emotions.
He's a person who had great hopes in Jesus. Those hopes were dashed. He colossally overreacted. And so he leads the Jewish authorities to Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. But that's not the end of the story.
We don't really know what happens to Judas after he betrays Jesus. Does he follow Jesus through the trial scenes just to see what happens? Does he see Pilate condemn him to die? Does he perhaps watch the flogging and have to feel the reality of what he's done?
When it becomes clear that they're not just going to do away with Jesus, but they're going to publicly shame him on a cross. Judas apparently had second thoughts.
After Jesus was condemned, there had to have been a part of him that did feel remorse.
Judas clearly feels guilty after he's done this thing. We see a lot of his conscience.
I have sinned by betraying innocent blood.
He takes the money and he throws it back. It's this blood money, and he doesn't want to get his hands dirty with it.
There's something terrifying about Judas, that you can be doing so well and then make a mistake from which you can never come back.
While all four Gospels of the New Testament name Judas as the betrayer of Jesus, only one of them, the Gospel of Matthew, tells how Judas's own story ends.
For me, the story of Judas is a tragic story. It's not the story of God giving up on Judas, but Judas giving up on himself.
He regrets, but he doesn't repent. And he doesn't trust that he can be forgiven, and so he despairs and hangs himself.
If you're a Jew and life is the greatest gift of God, you don't go out and kill yourself unless you have been absolutely, you shamed yourself, you shamed your family.
Judas is probably history's most tragic figure, the person who betrays the sinless Son of God and then commits suicide, Judas.
Judas is complained to people because this is someone who knew Jesus and somehow didn't make the right choices.